This is lecture number 4 in a series of 6 lectures on the book of Hebrews. And thus far in our outline we said that the book of Hebrews is a superior book because it talks about superior things. The superior person in this book is Jesus Christ. The superior purpose of the book is perfection. And then the superior priesthood, the Melchizedek priesthood. Chapters 7 to 10. Number 1, because it offers a better source. That is to say, it moves from the Aaronic priesthood to the Melchizedek priesthood. And at the close of the last tape, we were discussing the superiority of this priesthood. It is a royal priesthood. We said that Melchizedek was both king and priest. And of course, Aaron was a priest, but he was never a king. And then, number 3 in the outline, we also said that Christ was given an authoritative priesthood, which means that actually Christ, through Melchizedek, or I should say Melchizedek received tithes, and the Aaronic priest did not do that. So, secondly, that's what is involved. And then thirdly, Christ has a better priesthood than Aaron because he was given a timeless priesthood. Melchizedek in chapter 7 verse 3 was said to be without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. Now of course we know that this is not true with Aaron. Aaron died at the age of 123, and he was buried on Mount Hor, right outside the Promised Land on the eastern side of Jordan, in the plains of Moab, overlooking the plains of Moab. Now, as we have here in our notes, this does not necessarily mean, I think, the book of Hebrews chapter 7 verse 3, that Melchizedek was actually Christ, because it said, without descent, having neither beginning nor days nor end of life. It may be that he was Christ, but inasmuch as we have no record of his birth or death, he does become a type of Christ, not only in his office, but also in his origin. I'm not at all sure that he was Christ. It would be difficult for me to conceive in my own mind how that Christ could be an order after himself. If he was actually Melchizedek, then he would be Melchizedek and not just have a priesthood after Melchizedek. And if that's the case also, how long did Christ reign on earth? Now it's true in the Old Testament, Jesus came on occasion. He was probably the angel of the Lord. You remember he visited Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, and probably the one that visited Daniel in the lion's den there in the book of Daniel. But he had a very momentary type ministry to individuals. But if he was the priest of Jerusalem, this would mean that he would actually settle down there, and that's rather difficult to believe. But again, if he wasn't Christ, then who was Melchizedek? And we just don't know. But whatever, Christ was given a timeless priesthood. And then he was given an independent priesthood, like Melchizedek. In other words, the Aaronic priesthood, they became priests because of descent. But Jesus Christ, like Melchizedek, became a priest not by the descent of men, but by the declaration of God. So he was ordained, Melchizedek, by an oath from God and not from the tribe of Levi. Because in the Old Testament, as we've already said, no man could serve as a priest unless he descended from Aaron. But of course Jesus Christ, from the flesh, was not a descendant of Aaron or the tribe of Levi, but from the tribe of Judah. But he was declared a priest from the very decree of God, and not because he could trace his ancestry through the line of Aaron and through the tribe of Levi. Then number 6, we're discussing, or number 5 rather, we're discussing various superiorities, how that Christ was superior over that of Aaron, his priesthood. He was given an everlasting priesthood. In Hebrews 7, verse 17, a quotation from Psalm 110:4. Thou art a priest. Well, actually, I'll read that in chapter. I should have had my Bible open here to this 7th chapter. And there's something else I wanted to bring up here, so if I can remember it. In verse 17, for he testifieth, speaking now, the apostle speaking of David, who wrote Psalm 110, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. I wanted to add something there concerning point number 5, and I've forgotten it now, but he was given an everlasting priesthood. Not sure how to interpret this either. Does this mean that Jesus Christ will have a priestly function, carry on the office of a priest even in the millennium? Or is this just a general statement when it says thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek? Well, whatever, he was given an everlasting priesthood. And then number 6, these are reasons why Christ's office is superior to that of the Aaronic priesthood. He was given an immutable or a changeless priesthood. You know, the Old Testament priest, sometimes the high priest, the quality of service depended upon the character of the high priest. And you have several evil high priests mentioned, and they, of course, could not help the people very much. They were poor representatives of men before God. I think of Ananias, or Annas rather, in the New Testament, and Caiaphas. And these two men were ungodly men. They were both high priests. One was the ex-high priest, and one was the official high priest in the days of Jesus. And they actually arranged a trial that led to the death of, humanly speaking, the crucifixion of Jesus. And then in the book of Acts, they were the ones that had the Apostle Paul arrested and the one that had the apostles beaten. So these were evil high priests, but and they changed. They were very fickle. But Christ was given an immutable priesthood, and it wasn't affected by temperature or by taxes or weather or the stock market or immorality or morality. He was given a changeless priesthood. And then he was given, number 7, an all-inclusive priesthood. And I think this is exciting to contemplate here, because under this arrangement, Christ not only presented an offering. That's what a priest had to do, you know. A priest without an offering was, like to say, a steak without ketchup or something. I mean, that was the very function of a priest. And so a priest had to offer something. Well, Christ, being a priest, had to offer something. But he not only presented an offering, as the Aaronic priests would do, but he actually became one. And of course you have your statement here by author Ray Stedman in your notes. Let me read it. Stedman says, as a priest, Jesus Christ could find no unblemished sacrifice that he could offer except himself. So he offered himself as a sacrifice. There was found no other priest worthy of offering such a sacrifice, so Christ became both priest and victim. So here the shepherd now becomes the lamb. You see, a regular priest, of course, could not offer himself at all. But he could offer a lamb, but that lamb would only be good for a while, and then he'd have to offer another one. He continuously offered lambs and sacrifices. Now, Jesus Christ offered himself, which is something no other priest could do, and then this was a forever offering. It was once forever, and never needed to be offered again. This dual arrangement, where Christ was both the sacrifice and the priest, I think can be seen by listening to the 7 final statements that he made on the cross. You remember he was crucified around 9 o'clock in the morning, and he died around 3 in the afternoon, and he speaks 7 sentences, The first three, uttered from about 9 in the morning till noon, I think demonstrated his priestly ministry. And the final four, spoken of in the afternoon, spoke of his sacrificial role in ministry. Let's look at these. The first three that would speak of his priestly ministry. He said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Now you see, he's exercising the office of the priest here, because a priest is one who represents men before God, and he was representing these men. He wasn't saving them. Of course, they needed to be saved, but he was saying, don't hold this sin. They've got enough problems to worry about, the sin nature, and they're on their way to hell anyway. Lay not this sin to their charge. Forgive them, for they're not aware of the enormity of the crime that they're doing. But he represented these ungodly men. And then he ministered to the dying thief. That's what a priest does. That was his second saying. You remember? After that, he then talked to the priest, and talked to the thief, and he said, "Today thou shalt be with me in paradise." And then thirdly, as a priest, he ministered to his mother. "Woman," he said, "behold thy son." And so these first three statements, we see Jesus speaking as the priest. And now, statements 4, 5, 6, and 7, he speaks not as the priest, but as the sacrifice, not as the shepherd, but as the lamb. What was the fourth statement? my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" You see, that wasn't the statement of a priest. That was a statement of a lamb, of a sacrifice. And then he said, "I thirst." And then he said, "It is finished." And then he said, "Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit." There's a beautiful summary of the work of Christ here as we look at these 7 statements that he made on the cross. All right, and then number 8, we're looking at the reasons why Jesus' priesthood is superior than that of Aaron's priesthood. He was given a holy priesthood. Chapter 7, verse 26. "For such a high priest becomes us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners." Now, he identified with sinners. He loves sinners. He died for sinners. But he was separate from sinners and made higher than the heavens. So he was a holy, harmless, undefiled priest, and he was given a holy priesthood. Of course, this was in contrast to the Levitical priests, whose representatives often allowed corruption and idolatry on occasion to control their lives. We think of men like Nadab and Abihu. These were priests. But you know what they did? They were the sons of Aaron. And at the dedication of the temple, you read about this in Leviticus 10, they offered strange fire to the Lord, and God killed them, because the passage seems to indicate, you can read it there in Leviticus 10, that they were drunk at the time. So they had anything but a holy priesthood. And I think of Eli's sons, very ungodly men. And 1 Samuel says that they actually lay with women and had sexual relations with the women who would come to the temple. Now these were priests. They were anything but holy. And then even Samuel's sons. Samuel should have known better, because he saw how God punished Eli and how he judged Eli's sons for their ungodliness. But Samuel apparently didn't learn the lesson, because he allowed his sons to grow up and become ungodly priests also. But Jesus is different because he was given a holy priesthood. And then number 9, he was given a perfecting priesthood. A perfecting priesthood. In verses 19 and verse 25, we read of Hebrews 7. "Wherefore, because of all this," Paul says, "he is able also to save them to the uttermost that come unto God by him, seeing he ever liveth to make intercession," or intervention literally, "for them." Now, as you have in your notes here, I suggest that this verse is usually applied to the salvation of the lost. I've heard a number of ministers, and I've said this myself, and it's certainly true, but this verse does not talk about it. The statement, "Jesus saves from the guttermost to the uttermost." And if you're here unsaved, Jesus will save you, because in Hebrews 7:25 it says that He'll save them to the uttermost that cometh unto God by Him. This is not a reference, this verse, however, is not a reference to the salvation of the lost, but it is a reference to the preservation of the saved. Now notice it says that He'll do this because He ever liveth to make intercession for them. And we've said this often, but let us say it again, that Christ died on Calvary to get me saved, but He lives on high to keep me saved. And that's what Paul meant in the book of Romans, chapter 5, verse 10, when he said, "For if, when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by His death, by the death of His Son, how much more, being reconciled, we shall be saved through His life." What saves the sinner? The death of Christ. What saves the believer? The life of Christ. His death saved me. His life keeps me saved. It was His blood that got me saved, and His intercessions now that keep me saved. And again, in Romans 8, Paul brings us out again. He says, "Who is he that condemneth? It is Christ who died, yea, rather that is risen again, who is even at the right hand of God, who also maketh intercession for us." So He was given a perfecting priesthood. Someone has observed that the name Jesus, J-E-S-U-S, can stand for just exactly suits us sinners. J-E-S-U-S. I can understand the emotion of the songwriter. He must have been thinking about Hebrews 7 when he wrote that beautiful song. Jesus is the sweetest name I know, and He's just the same as His lovely name. And that's the reason why I love Him so, for Jesus is the sweetest name I know. So, Jesus Christ has a superior priesthood because it offers a better source from Aaron to Melchizedek. And then number B, it offers a better script. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, a script is a written program. Speak of a television script or some kind of radio script. It's a program written, and then you follow the lines. And the Father has written the lines here, of course, and you have the script of the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, and then the script of the New. And so the Old Covenant, and we'll mention that pretty soon, was associated with Moses. And there are many covenants in the Bible. And of course the three most important is the Abrahamic covenant and the Davidic covenant and then the New Covenant. But there were a number of other covenants. There was the Palestinian covenant and the Mosaic covenant. And he really talks about the Palestinian and the Mosaic covenant here in Hebrews chapter 7. I'll talk about this in just a minute, but let me read, in Hebrews chapter 8. He contrasts two covenants, but let me read our introduction here. The Old Testament Hebrew word for covenant was berit. It literally means to cut or to divide. And you find that often. You find the first time mentioned in Genesis 15. This cutting was in reference to the cutting of sacrificial animals. So to make a covenant with someone, to make a berith with someone, would be to cut an animal. We've gone into this somewhat when I taught Genesis, but that's been a long time ago. So you remember God told Abraham back then that he would inherit the land of Palestine, and God would keep him safe forever, and God would make him to be a mighty nation. And Abraham said, "How shall I know that you're going to keep all these promises? Do you have a sign to give me? Can you ratify it somehow?" And God told him to take an animal, or take some animals, and he did, and he cut them up. And then you remember, God walked through the pieces by himself, and he put Abraham to sleep. So if I wanted to make a covenant with you, and I lived back then, what you and I would do, we wouldn't go down to the courthouse, because there wasn't any courthouse, and sign a legal agreement. We would take some animals and divide them up and then cut them and burn them, and we would walk through those pieces of flesh, and we would actually be saying, if we, in the presence of pain and blood and sorrow and death here, we're pledging to be true one to the other. And so that's what it means. To cut an animal was an immutable covenant. It was a berith, a covenant. And I'll continue to read this. Between these bloody pieces of flesh, the two parties of the berith would walk. However, in the Genesis 15 account, God put Abraham asleep and walked through alone, thus signifying that particular berith, that cutting, to be unconditional. This ceremony was also known as a blood covenant. This Old Testament concept is brought out in the New Testament by the Greek word diatheke. A diatheke is a treaty between two parties, but binding only on one according to the terms fixed by the other. In other words, God's covenant to Abraham was an unconditional covenant. That's why he put him to sleep. If Abraham had walked through those pieces, then it would have been conditional. And God would say, now Abraham, I'll keep my end of the bargain if you keep your end of the bargain. But God knew that Abraham wasn't going to keep his end of the bargain. God knew that in the very next chapter, chapter 16, Abraham would get out of the will of God and marry a pagan girl by the name of Hagar. And he knew later on in Genesis 20 that Abraham was going to get out of the will of God again and going to lie about his wife before a Philistine king. So God said, well, if I let him go through those pieces, it'll be a conditional covenant, and that rascal won't keep his end of the bargain. I know he won't. And so I'll have to send him to hell, or I'll have to renege on mine. But I just better walk through those pieces myself. So an unconditional covenant. But there were some conditional covenants in the Bible, and one of the conditional covenants was the covenant given by God to Moses at Mount Sinai. That's sometimes called the Mosaic covenant, and sometimes it's called the Palestinian covenant. It's basically the same. There's a little difference, but it's basically the same. And here was the covenant. God said, all right, now you're going to enter the land soon, and if you'll behave yourself, and if you'll not worship the gods of the Canaanites, and if you'll not forget my word, if you'll put your trust in me, then I'll give you blessing, I'll give you health, I'll give you prosperity, and I'll pour out my goodness from heaven upon you. But if you disobey me, if you turn your back upon me, if you go a-whoring after the Canaanite gods, then you sorry rascals, I'll run you out. Well, they disobeyed God. They reneged on their part of this conditional contract, and God kept His word. He ran them out. He plucked them from the land. So this was a Mosaic covenant. The Mosaic covenant was a conditional covenant. And so here in Hebrews 8, Paul contrasts this one conditional covenant with the unconditional covenant. And the new covenant has a better script attached to it than the old covenant, because the old covenant was conditional. Now, not Abraham. That's tied in with the New Testament here, of course, but the Mosaic covenant was conditional. And remember, he writes to Jews now, the Apostle Paul does, and they're concerned about Moses, their great lawgiver, and they were very proud of what happened at Mount Sinai in Exodus 19, and when God actually spoke to them, and He had spoken to no other nation, and the author said that's all well and good, but there's a sad story there, because we disobeyed Him, and it was a two-way covenant. But now God has given a much better covenant. This is an unconditional covenant. It's like the one that He gave Abraham, not like the one He gave Moses. Now, the Old Covenant, of course, was mediated by Moses, and it was conditional. And then it could not produce the necessary righteousness. The law could say, do this, but the law couldn't give you the strength or the power to do what it said. So it could not produce the Mosaic covenant. That's what he's talking about. It couldn't produce the necessary righteousness that it demanded. And it was written on dead stones. Exodus 32, Moses goes on top of Mount Sinai, and God wrote the Ten Commandments on two jagged rocks. Now, that's the Old Covenant. That's the Mosaic covenant. And now he says Christ has a better covenant because it is a new covenant. It is mediated by Christ. Moses gave the Old Covenant, but Jesus Christ gives the new covenant. And then it's unconditional. Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 9. He says, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt. Now he's talking about the Exodus, of course, because they continued not in my covenant. Now again, folks, this is not the Abrahamic covenant. It's the covenant God made through Moses. And I regarded them not, saith the Lord. Well, he said, I'm going to give them a new covenant now, and this covenant is going to be unconditional, like the Abrahamic covenant. Unconditional, no strings attached. And this covenant can and does produce the necessary righteousness. Hebrews 8 and verse 11. And then this covenant was not written on tables of stone, but this was written on living hearts. Now, what is involved in this new covenant? And here you have 4 suggestions concerning the new covenant in Hebrews 8. One of them is this, that the church has replaced Israel as the participant in the new covenant. Now, this does not distinguish the church from Israel, and this is totally refuted by Paul in Romans 9, 10, 11. The second theory says that this new covenant is associated with the nation Israel only. And he's just talking about that new covenant that someday God will, during the tribulation, work miracles and save the nation Israel. Of course, he'll do that. But as we have in your notes here, this seems to be out of context with Hebrews 8. Why would Paul bring that up at this time? The third position is that there are actually 2 covenants in this chapter, 2 new covenants. One refers to Israel, and the other refers to the church. That might be, but I like the fourth, and the fourth position explains the new covenant this way. There's only one new covenant which will be fulfilled by Israel in the future, but it's shared by the church today. So this was given to Israel, but it will be and is shared by the church today, and that's the position that I think is the most logical one. But here you have the Old Covenant, Mosaic covenant, as contrasted to the New Covenant, the covenant mediated by Christ, the unconditional covenant that could indeed produce the needed righteousness. All right? We're saying that Jesus Christ has a superior priesthood, and that priesthood is the Melchizedek priesthood, because it offers a better source from Aaron to Melchizedek. It offers a better script from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant. And then it offers a better sanctuary, or a better temple, from the earthly sanctuary to the heavenly sanctuary. Let's notice now a little about the earthly sanctuary. There's one thing about this, that it constantly had to be rebuilt. Remember, it was built by Moses and lasted for a while. Actually, probably, let's see, I suppose a couple of 100 years. When they got in the land, we're not sure what happened to the tabernacle. We know when it was built, but when was it destroyed? It was completed in Exodus chapter 40, and then it was set up in the land, the city of Shiloh, when the children of Israel came and took the land of Palestine. It was set up at Shiloh. And that's the Hebrew word for peace, of course, and it was there for a while. We're not absolutely sure, but many Bible students believe that this tabernacle was destroyed by the Philistines during the days of Eli in 1 Samuel 4. So Jesus Christ now, his priesthood has a better sanctuary because it is an eternal one that is not being continually destroyed. Well, of course, after the destruction of the tabernacle, years later, during Solomon's day, a temple was put up. And that temple was built around 930 BC, somewhere along in there. And for some 3 centuries it stood, but then a fellow by the name of Nebuchadnezzar came along, and he destroyed that temple. And so once again, you have the earthly temple being destroyed. And so 70 years later, during the days of Ezra and Zerubbabel and Haggai and Nehemiah and Zechariah and some of these other fellows, the third building went up. The second temple, but if you count the tabernacle, actually the third building went up, and it was finished by Herod in the days of Jesus. And wouldn't you know it, it had just been finished, and then the Romans came and destroyed it in the year 70 A.D., some 30 years after the resurrection of Christ. Well, there will be one more temple that will go up during the tribulation, and that will be destroyed, as I understand prophecy, by the Antichrist. So you have all these tabernacles and temples being destroyed by the Philistines and the Babylonians and the Romans and the Antichrist and who knows what else is involved. But this tabernacle that we're talking about now, this temple, is a heavenly one, and it is not of this world, and it is not temporary, and it is not a copy or a shadow of the real thing as the earthly tabernacle was. Another thing, the earthly tabernacle was totally inaccessible to most people. For example, let's say that here is a group of individuals, 5 of them. You have a Gentile, and you have a Jewish woman, you have a Jewish man from the tribe of Judah, and you have a man from the tribe of Levi, and then you have the high priest. So you have a Gentile man, you have a Jewish woman, you have a man from the tribe of Judah, another man from the tribe of Levi, and then you have the high priest. Okay, now these 5 men are going to visit the temple, or these 5 individuals. What happens? Well, the Gentile can't even get close to the place. Okay? The woman, Jewish woman, can enter the temple and go to the court of women. Now, they had a court of the Gentiles too, but that was really outside. But she can get closer. The Jewish woman could even get closer than the Gentile man, but she couldn't go very far. All right, the man from the tribe of Judah could go a little further than the Hebrew woman could go, but he wasn't from the tribe of Levi. He couldn't go too far. Well, the Levite, the priest, could pretty well get into the temple area and actually into the holy place, but he'd have to stop because he could not go beyond the temple veil. And then the high priest of the 5 would be the only one in our party now that could actually enter into the Holy of Holies. But keep in mind, he could only do this one time a year during correspond to our October, November. This is Yom Kippur, the great Day of Atonement. And then when he went in, he would stand. He couldn't sit or relax. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means the heavenly tabernacle has been opened up since Jesus said it is finished. And it means now that the vilest Gentile skid row bum, let alone the Jewish woman or the Jew or anybody else, the vilest drunk who is sober enough to accept Jesus Christ on the skid rows of this world, can actually have access to the very Holy of Holies, the very throne of grace, before he even loses his whiskey hangover. Now that's the difference between the earthly tabernacle and the heavenly tabernacle. It was to most totally inaccessible, the earthly, but not so to the heavenly tabernacle. As Paul says, let us therefore come boldly, not arrogantly, but confidently, boldly to the throne of grace, there to find a very present help in time of need. And then the earthly tabernacle was associated with God's first work of creation, while the heavenly tabernacle is associated with God's new work of creation, which of course is that of redemption. And then it was made by human hands, the earthly tabernacle. The heavenly tabernacle was made by God's Word. The earthly tabernacle featured the blood of animals. It was a very bloody place. The heavenly tabernacle, of course, is sprinkled by the blood of one lamb, and that's the Lamb of God. And then the earthly tabernacle had no abiding hope. The Jews did not know from one year to another if their temple would be saved, because the enemies of Judah seemed to be constantly crossing and recrossing their tiny little land. But our tabernacle is eternal in the heavens. Now, is this tabernacle in heaven real? It's amazing that there are Bible teachers, and some of them know far more than I do, and I, as far as the language is concerned of the Bible, Hebrew and Greek, and I wouldn't argue with them, but I wouldn't question their sincerity or spirituality, but to me it's incredible that a person can read all these passages about the heavenly tabernacle, and in the book of Revelation the heaven is opened, and John the apostle on a number of occasions says that he saw the altar of incense. He actually saw it in this heavenly tabernacle, and how Bible teachers could say it really doesn't mean that there's a literal tabernacle in heaven. Well, I have a problem with that. If it doesn't mean that it's a literal tabernacle, then what does it mean? In other words, if this tabernacle, these temples and tabernacles on earth are patterns, then what is the real thing? You see, God told Moses, I'll give you a pattern of a building I want you to build when you come down from the Mount of Sinai, and it's a pattern of the temple that's already existing in heaven. That's what God told Moses. Now, I'm sure that's how Moses understood that. But yes, I definitely believe that it was a very real tabernacle, and I believe that the blood of Christ was sprinkled literally upon that mercy seat in that tabernacle after his crucifixion on the cross. Well, in Hebrews chapter 9, verses 24, 25, and 26, we read these words, "For Christ is not entered into the holy place made with hands, which are the figures of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us." Sometimes when a famous movie star is at a theater in our big cities, it says, the marquee says, "Now appearing in person," such and such. Well, the heavenly marquee would read, "Now appearing in person, Jesus Christ," and He's making intercession for us. In verse 25, "Not yet that He should offer Himself often, as the high priest entereth into the holy place every year with the blood of others." But the Bible says, "For then must He often have suffered since the foundation of the world." So the priest had to go in yearly, but Christ doesn't do that. If He had to do that, then He'd have to go through this thing every year. But the author says, no, that's not the case with our high priest, because now once, in the end of the ages, hath He appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of Himself. Then it goes on to say, "And is it appointed unto men once to die, but after that the judgment? So Christ was once offered to bear the sins of many, and unto them that look for Him shall He appear the second time without sin unto salvation." And we said that the earthly tabernacle had no abiding hope, but the heavenly tabernacle it does, because of these little phrases in Hebrews 9, 24, 26, and 28. He hath appeared, that was his former work as a prophet. He is appearing, now to appear, verse 24, that's his present work as a priest, and he shall yet appear, in verse 28. This is his future work as a king. What a marvelous example here, illustration of the grace of God. All right, so we've looked at 2 or 3 of the 4 under Roman numeral 3 now, the superior priesthood, Melchizedek. Jesus has a superior priesthood because it offers a better source from Aaron to Melchizedek. It offers a better script from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant. It offers a better sanctuary from the earthly sanctuary to the heavenly sanctuary. And then, of course, and we've already really touched on this, it offers a better sacrifice from animal lambs to the anointed lamb in chapter 10. Notice verse 4 of chapter 10, it offers a better sacrifice, for it is not possible that the blood of bulls and goats should take away sin. Now you see, the priest had to continually go in and offer sacrifices. It is estimated, for example, on the Passover night that our Lord was crucified, or that he was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, that as many as 250,000 rams may have died during that period. Maybe not during that very night, but during the few weeks before and after that. This was a special time of sacrificing and everything, and Jesus doubtless realized when he walked over the Kidron River, and he looked down, and this was a river that flowed in back of the temple, and it was probably a muddy, bloody red that night because the priests used it as sort of a sewage disposal system, and we could say, and he realized that soon his blood would be staining a cross red, and God's perfect lamb would die. But what a waste of mutton that night, because all that blood, that river of animal blood, could not take away the sin that his blood would soon take away. So these sacrifices in the Old Testament for a while could cover sin, but these sacrifices could never cleanse this sin. We have time for a poem by Isaac Watts here. Not all the blood of beasts on Jewish altar slain could give the guilty conscience peace or wash away the stain. But Christ, the heavenly Lamb, takes all our sins away, a sacrifice of nobler name and richer blood than they. My faith would lay her hand on that dear head of thine, while like a penitent I stand, and there confess my sin. My soul looks back to see the burden thou didst bear, while hanging on the accursed tree, and knows her guilt was there. Believing we rejoice to see the curse removed, and bless the Lamb with cheerful voice, and sing redeeming love. This point will close lecture number 4.